Arab-Turkish relations actually demands constant inquiry and studies. I myself own a sizable archival collection, including documents in Ottoman Turkish, written in Arabic alphabets. In fact, those were the property of a man who served in the Ottoman army for 1 year before he traveled to Alexandria, lived in Cairo for a while, then came to the States in 1913. The picture is more complicated than we would like to believe. In fact, depending on the period we're discussing here, Islam in general, or the Ottoman Empire itself, was the last vestiges of an era where frontier borders did not exist as we know them today. And national identity did not exist in the way that it does today. At the time, it was ecumenical. For example, today we associate Catholicism with France, Protestantism with England, and so on and so forth. The Ottoman Empire was truly a global Islamic empire, as were the Abbasid and the Umayyad dynasties before it. So it didn't have frontier borders, and anyone of its subject would be just that, just for the simple reason of living there. So there was a measure of autonomy in Egypt, for example, in Arabic-speaking territories, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula, although Ottoman influence did not spread to all of Saudi Arabia, but only to the western part, in order to maintain the pretext that they are the guardians of Islam. As a matter of fact, the guardian of Mecca lived in Istanbul as a guest. You can put that in quotes in the latter years of the Ottomans. But yes, people were tolerated and accepted for what they were. Arabic was spoken. However, things began to change because of Western encroachment into the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. I am one who believes that the Ottoman Empire spared the Arab Middle East unspeakable violence longer than other areas were actually enjoyed. For example, the Europeans, the English and the British and the Portuguese and the Spanish were all over the place. The British and the French were in Southeast Asia already, in India and Vietnam. Africa was torn to shreds by Western Europeans as well. The Ottoman Empire kept Europe out of the Middle East longer than any place else on the planet. However, those were changing times, rapidly changing times. That age of exploration paid off for the Europeans. Their influence and wealth began to rise just when the Ottoman Empire's influence began to decline, when trade routes bypassed them to the Far East and the wealth of the East. Not only silk, but mostly spice, which was a way to preserve food and give it flavor in Europe. So as a matter of fact, the Ottomans' power and influence began by serving as a conduit for trade in Western Anatolia. So when it became a vast, powerful empire with its own economy and was incorporated into a global economy, Europeans began to steadily gain the upper hand ever since the 1683 Ottoman attempt to breach the gates of Vienna. And that was the beginning of decline for the Ottomans. And with this change came the need for reforms and modernization. And after the French Revolution in the 18th century, you have this idea of the nation state emerging, that sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty, that on a defined piece of land, like-minded people, the same customs, traditions, more or less the same religion, can live in sovereignty next to other sovereign states. All of that was new in the Middle East. and there was intense pressure on the Ottomans to modernize quickly. In their haste for modernization, for at least for a time, there was a strong feelings which began as reformist ideas to create a Turkish state, hence, Turkism, and ultimately Kemal Ataturk and the triumvirate, Enver Pasha and Talat and militant members of the Turkish oligarchy. So at that time, in order to preserve this Turkish state, it had to have a uniform language, uniform customs, project itself as a nation state. And the Turks were reluctant to give up the Arab provinces, who began to grumble and ask for autonomy. That's when an opening for the French colonialism and British colonialism opened up. So the British did not wait. They were in Egypt in 1882, occupied the place, which was technically part of the Ottoman Empire, and stifled any modernization during that time. In the Arab provinces, the French, under the pretext of extending protection to their co-religionists, the so-called Maronites or an offshoot of Catholicism, they managed to create an administrative district, or mutasarrifiyya, as it's called in Turkish, around the area of Beirut, which ultimately they separated from this geographic area we call natural Syria or geographic Syria. That was by the mid-19th century, as a matter of fact. Many Arabs were saying, we cannot wait, we have to have our own autonomy. And it was different methods that were applied in order to achieve independence. So the Islamists, Islamic reformers, said we should remain part of the Ottoman Empire. We are Muslims. They are the guardians of Islam. And they began to change their mind and ask for more and more autonomy. But they were very sophisticated in that they recognized that the British and the French were waiting to pounce on the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And they understood that if, in fact, the Ottoman Empire collapses, it will be replaced by the French and the British. Ultimately, that's exactly what happened. So I liken the situation to sort of a walnut under the, two parts of a vice, a nutcracker, if you will, squeezing. And those two parts are the British and the French, who, as a matter of fact, were afraid of each other because they were at wars with each other for a long time and held off until World War I. When World War I ended, during which the Arabs made a fateful decision to join the Allies against the Ottomans, Turks, and the Germans, with the promise by the British to grant them autonomy, as a matter of fact, to grant them independence in natural Syria, an area that includes Syria proper, the western fringe of Iraq maybe, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. That was called Bilad al-Sham in Arabic, or geographic Syria. Of course, the British and the French had no intention of keeping their promises, because a year before this, a few months at least before they made those promises, they entered into what is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan among themselves into spheres of influence. And the contours of that agreement more or less correspond to the political map of the Middle East as we know it today. So some people saw through all this. Some important nationalists, among them Shakib Arsalan, an important Druze intellectual, who knew what was coming. So did members of those anti-Ottoman reformist societies who wanted autonomy and who did not feel like they were getting a fair shake by the CUP, for the Committee for Union and Progress. And they knew that if the Ottoman Empire collapses, foreign occupation will set in, namely French and British. Precisely what happened after World War I. So Arab-Turkish relations are very complex. They are part of a similar historical, cultural narrative. When I spent time in Istanbul, I felt at home. I can't even describe it, to be honest with you. I could understand every other word I could read in Turkish. The food, the smells, the people, the manners, the hospitality were all familiar. As a matter of fact, listening to songs, you find out that songs you grew up with are actually Turkish songs. From that period when the two people grappled with a very, very complex, changing political situation. But the cultural ties are extremely strong. It can never be severed between Turks and Arabs because they shared the common history for nearly 5 centuries. Yet, Western encroachment infused both peoples with a distinct political agenda in order to create their nation states. There was no way around that. And the result of that was this irrational, frankly, extremely painful anti-Muslim feelings in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, which persist to this day. And most people don't understand that Turks and Greeks lived in peace and harmony for a long time, and it was the Greek Fidik Hatera, or the Society of Friends, who basically took this idea of nationalism to an extreme and began to engage in violence against Turks and Greeks alike, which invited a response by the Turks. And of course, the French and the British intervened with their own interests in mind, precisely what they did between Maronites and Druze in Syria itself. So at the end of the day, it was an end of an era. It was a cycle of rise, after which you can only decline, frankly, in the case of the Ottoman Empire. And it was time for Arabs to run their affairs if they can. And they tried their best to navigate both Ottomanist, modernist, and secular trends and they tried to navigate a middle of the road path. Unfortunately, when Turkey lost in World War I to the Allies, the French and the British just moved in and made true on their promises to each other of carving spheres of interest, of influence in the Arab world.
You have been in Istanbul, so you saw a lot of Ottoman buildings and mosques and architects. What you are thinking, the architects of Ottoman? What do you think? I mean, what's your imagination about the architects of Ottoman Empire? Because you saw in Istanbul. Have you been in Sultanahmet Mosque? Or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So what do you think about their style?
As I mentioned, it really all looked familiar, although it had this distinctive Turkish style, especially in the mosques. But when I entered the mosque in Istanbul, or for that matter, an old Orthodox church, I felt the same way I did when I entered the Holy Sepulchre or Al-Aqsa Mosque in Palestine. It becomes tangible, the fact that that we are part of a similar cultural narrative. Islam is the same Islam in Istanbul as it is in other parts of the Arab world. The architecture kind of emphasizes that, all those archways, and in some parts of Istanbul, you could be walking in the old city of Jerusalem, like the Kasbah, the big marketplace, is very, very close to how Jerusalem is actually set up, which is no accident because Ottomans built most of it for the as a matter of fact, or at least presided over its development. I don't know
Yeah,
else to say.
about the Ottoman architects, yeah, not so big difference, but there is some small difference. In Ottoman architects, if you compare with Arabic mosques and
Yeah, there's some differences, yes.
Differences, but-
I mean, the domes, the use of the domes and the square.
yeah,
But
Sinan, you know, he brings some dome style more. Yeah,
yeah, I'm not an expert on architecture,
okay, just,
but the mihrab faces Mecca. I mean, the once you're inside, it is very, very similar. Al-Aqsa and Hagia Sophia looks very familiar too, as a mosque. I mean, it's like Byzantine influence also there.
according to you, your personal idea, what was the reason that Ottoman lived centuries to centuries, like more than 600 years is long period for living for a nation, not nation, a state.
I mean, lasted.
Yeah, how they lived so long, because they didn't live only in Arabic countries. They have been in Europe, some Africa, some. So they mix up with a lot of cultures. I mean, they were there, soldiers and government, but they lived so long. What was the reason live alive?
Lead or lived?
Lived.
Yeah.
I mean, how they lived so long? It was more than 600 years.
Yeah.
The Ottoman were existing. So what was the reason of that, according to you? What was their success?
Yeah. Well, there are like geopolitical global changes that opened the door for the Ottomans to, first of all, to establish a dynasty and spread as far and wide as they did, and to last for as long as they did, from the 1280s all the way to World War One. And these have to do with a very refined and considered process of preparing leaders, young leaders, for the rule. And there are also economic reasons, and Bursa in Western Anatolia was a gateway between East and West. So all the silk and the spices came from the Far East, which Europe could hardly do without, came through this small dynasty which began by Uthman and his son Orhan. And those are the folks who established a small dynasty which became very wealthy. And around it, there was a huge void, political void, cultural void, because of years of conflict. What created that void were the Mongol invasions, which were brutal and extremely destructive. That's when the libraries in Baghdad, holding 400,000 volumes of books, were ditched in the river, turning the water of the river black with ink, as the folklore says. That wreaked havoc into the remnants of the Arab Islamic dynasties, and that's when the Ottomans, who became committed Muslims, found an opening in order to preserve the faith and also grow and expand. So from that small dynasty in Western Anatolia, Europe was there for the taking, where it was no comparison between the high level of culture, even in times of war, within the Islamic realm and Europe at the time. So the East had a great deal to offer to the West, and the Ottomans were privy to this high culture, all the scientific innovations, industrial innovations, and trade, and high culture and literature. So the Ottomans were actually emulated by the West for a very, very long period of time. And of course, they spread wherever there was a void within a measured and nuanced process of well-planned marriages by the sultans, by the Ottoman sultans themselves, and by establishing the palace services and in a very elaborate system of centralized government. and granting, land grants for their sipahis and or the mounted cavalry and etc. etc. So they were able to bring in many cultures, many cultural narratives into the fold, into this realm of Ottoman rule, and govern from Istanbul itself, from a central location. But the key, I think, was the meticulous and highly sophisticated process of preparing future sultans that won the day, who, by the way, were in competition with each other very often.
What was the meaning of conquering to Istanbul in the world history?
I'm sorry?
The conquering to Istanbul, Fatih Sultan Mehmed has conquered.
Yeah.
What was the meaning of that for world history? What's changed?
Yeah. Well, one of the largest or most powerful dynasties or empires was a remnant of the Greek and Roman empires, which was a Byzantine centered in Constantinople. So Constantinople was extremely powerful, surrounded by a formidable wall, surrounded on one side by the Bosphorus, the water. So natural, defense lines. And the Ottomans, as a matter of fact, spread beyond Constantinople before they were able to breach the city, which had access to the open waters at the time. So, of course, breaching those walls and finally subduing Constantinople, and which became Istanbul, by 1453, was a historic feat. It did not come easy. It had to do with making use of artillery, but also a sustained siege, which commands a lot of energy and high level of loyalty and an entire campaign of supplying your soldiers and making sure they stick with it until it is completed. And of course, to their credit, when the Ottomans entered the city, they did not destroy and pillage the whole city, which in itself an accomplishment. That's what soldiers did. Again, this is an Islamic, in keeping with Islamic customs. They knew that the patriarch inside the city is a monotheist. They actually engaged in trade with them in one way or the other during the siege and before. And the city basically transformed, and its population increased, and the Christian and Jewish minorities in it flourished for a long time. So Christianity and Judaism, Jewish traditions continued in the city to this day, of course. But opening Constantinople was although in itself did not bring devastation on the Orthodox Christians of the city or the Jewish inhabitants, it jolted the rest of Europe into mobilizing to deal with this Eastern menace called Islam, which they did not understand. So hence this East-West conflict took on a new dimension. So as a matter of fact, during Ottoman period is when Orientalism, as we understand it today, became was animated. The idea that how the West views the East as its contestant other, as Edward Said explains.
When the Ottoman took to the Caliphate, they make it grow up, or the Caliphate became weak. What's changed?
Well, the Caliphate, or the first four caliphs in Islam, is an idealized period in Islam. Those were the contemporaries of the Prophet. They knew him personally. All of them were revered. All of them were men of letters, and they adhered to the early, simplest, perhaps, teachings of Islam, or in its purest sense. After that period, because the Prophet likely on purpose did not designate a successor, and instead instructed that they discuss the matter and decide among themselves, created problems, of course. So what happened to the Caliphate during Ottoman time? I think it was a time of diversification of rule, whereby the Sheikh of Islam became an independent office from the Sultan, but remained a source of religious authority, whereas the Sultan became the source of administrative and military authority. And they both lived in a balance. And you could find that balance in the high periods of Islamic rule. It's always a negotiation between a semi-secular tinge or economic or early capitalist administration and religious one. And they always kept each other in balance. So Islam could accommodate to changing times that way. And I think in the Middle East and Turkey and elsewhere, that negotiation remains intact. As a matter of fact, if you forward to the present and what became of the Caliphate or this negotiation between semi-secular or secular administrative life and Islamic jurisprudence, Turkey is leading the way because it is explored. Its experiment with democracy as such is longer than any other country in the Middle East. And despite the problems currently, people are navigating those two trends, Islam and modernity, more successfully than elsewhere. And I hope it remains that way, that it remains peaceful, and so that other countries can draw lessons.
Who is your favorite sultan?
Suleiman al-Qanuni, Suleiman the lawgiver.
Could you, my question will not be in the movie, so
Yeah.
if you answer that my favorite sultan is like this, because your favorite sultan, according to you, who is your favorite? And
Well, I like several of them, to be honest with you. Selim III, for example, is the one who made the serious effort towards modernization. Of course, he was rebuffed by the Janissary. It took Murad IV to complete the task. But all of them basically understood the need for drilling in different fashion, for the army and to advance forward. Of course, the zenith of Ottoman life took place during the reign of Suleiman al-Qanuni, or Suleiman the lawgiver. That's when jurisprudence, interpretations of the Quran itself, and civil life basically became nuanced. You have semblances of the need, implementation of civil law that granted equality across divides, even across class, not just ethnicity, which did not mean too much during that time. So, but it also made the central government powerful, such that there was a period of stability that reigned across the empire, notwithstanding skirmishes with the Persians to the east. But that was a period of stability where people had enough food on the table. They can engage in all manners of artistic expressions, poetry, high culture, the arts. So that stability is actually is what dynasties strive for in their lifetime. So that's why it's my favorite period.
Well, what was the reason that that small tribe in Ottoman, Osman Ghazi and Orhan Ghazi, well, how they grow up so fast, do you think?
I think it was a combination of things. There was a void, a cultural and military void by Mongol invasions. And most of all, it was a keen grasp of the tenets of Islam and using those to create a dynastic legacy. There are rules within Islam that lend themselves to order, law and order. But then they progress beyond that, and their Ottoman or Turkish cultural narratives were woven into Islam in order to create a very tight-knit dynasty in a sphere of decline on both sides, on the European side and to the east, of course. And they can only grow, so they kept gaining territory, and it was a process of successful delegation of authority and property to subordinates and family members, while commanding their loyalty to the central government that allowed for this expansion. And the rest, of course, is well-placed marriages on the European side. But then the Ottomans understood that their depth lies to the east, where the source of Islam is, because Europe was very backward at the time. So, and then the Ottomans spread eastward until they ran into the Persians and the eastern fringes. But they never abandoned, of course, and they understood the importance of extending their influence over the holiest places in Islam, in Palestine and mostly in Western Saudi Arabia, in Mecca and Medina.
According to you, what's the meaning of civilizations, and how the Ottoman became civilizations? What you are thinking, their civilizational improvements and developing them success?
Well, I'm not an expert on ancient Turkish culture. It is a very ancient culture that actually predates Islam itself, as does Arabic culture, by the way. The language itself predates Islam. However, Islam outstretched Arabism and Turkism and even Persian narratives. So what makes a civilization is the successful process of extending stability from a central government to the fringes, where people can function and engage in high culture successfully in the relative stability, and also engage in commerce. Of course, Europeans have very different views on the meaning of civilization, which were subordinated to expansion that made enslavement a focal point, frankly, for their commerce. It was through slavery that they expanded their reign and gained massive wealth by forcing the locals to mine for gold and silver, and also engage in farming and agriculture on their behalf, namely, from deer skin to beaver skin and to tobacco and sugar and molasses, etc., etc. So But Orientalism, the essence of Orientalism, has to do with a competition between two different perceptions of civilization. And the West has always been keen, or many parts of the West, to varying degrees at different times, insisted that they are the standard of civilization until it became, boiled down to essentially eating with a fork and knife as opposed to by your hands, not by how many people you killed before or after dinner. The Ottoman Empire did not embark in its entire history on a massive program of killing or eradicating any part of its subjects. Whereas, World War I, which was a European problem, claimed the lives of upward of 18 to 20 million people. And they did the same thing in World War II in the name of civilization. And slavery itself was justified as, a white man's burden to spread civilization and teach the, people outside the Western Hemisphere how to conduct their lives, how to think, how to behave, how to dress. That was civilization to the West. Whereas in the East, it has to do with a very, very deep understanding of culture, of cultural traits that beyond conquest. So this is basic differences. So outside the Mongol invasion, you couldn't find periods in history in the Near East, within the Ottoman realm or before that, Islamic civilizations, whereby ethnic cleansing was practiced on a massive scale. It was about absorption. Enter the realm of explorations, and you have the eradication of entire cultures from South America to Africa to the Far East. And of course, all that was a prelude.
Okay.
Well, to take the example of the United States, for example, when it comes to defining civilization or writing that into your narrative, that became a big topic during the Spanish-American War, 1898. And that war was carried out in the name of civilization. So the Americans found it necessary to flex their muscles and enter the imperialist age. So in order to satisfy its economic needs, as was the case with Europe, beginning with the age of explorations, raw material, silver, gold, beaver skin, you name it, and sugar, so that they can carry on with their civilized life and wear those fancy hats in Europe. The US found it necessary to inherit, as a matter of fact, inherited the white man burden, that idea that Northwestern Europeans are endowed with a gift that they have to basically go beyond their borders, go to Africa and elsewhere in the world, and spread this civilization, which is boiled down to a mode of dress, maybe speaking the conqueror's language only, and adhering to their religion, which is mostly either Catholicism or Protestantism. All that in the name of civilization. But, one argument, for civilization outside these Western models can be made on behalf of ancient African civilizations. 20,000 years before those rudimentary laws began in the Middle East, which spread to Europe and became the foundation for European civilization. You have complex societies made up of 20,000 people or so, organized along hierarchy that made sense, from a central location to farming and hunters and gatherers, who functioned as a coherent society, living in perfect harmony with their environment, precisely what the indigenous people of North America did for 10,000 years or 11,000 years before Europeans arrived. And in 200 short years, they decimated the people, their resources, the environment. They overfished, they overhunted, and the people of this continent, as is the case with South America, dwindled from millions to mere hundreds of thousands.
When I was in all communist countries, when I went to their library, they were writing that because some parts of Ottoman have been Ottoman were barbarian. They come and they kill everybody here. They are the civilization, not the state. Only have sword and kill. They didn't have a state system. They are not well organized. Some ignore people are in this. According to you, Ottoman power was only the fighting war, or they had some good architecture or some state system, organization. Could you talk in this?
Well, depending on what period you're talking about in this long Ottoman history, statecraft was the essence of Ottoman success to begin with. So, and that can hardly happen if you engage in irrational violence and conquest against your own subjects. It wouldn't be an empire per se. It could not exist under those circumstances. And that's what distinguishes Ottoman realm on history and narrative from European explorations, which were in competition with each other, which basically sought to subvert the environment and the people, the conquered people, for its economic needs. It was a one-way exchange, whereas in the Ottoman Empire and beyond, it was a two-way street. You enter a period of conflict, yes, which is violent, yes, but the violence ends and the outcome is some kind of coexistence, whereby those conquered people become very much part, intrinsic part of your dynasty, of your realm. Some of who were taken into, forcible military service, themselves become the leaders and even sultans and governors. None of that happened when Europeans encountered non-Europeans, whether in Africa, in South America, in North America, in the Middle East later on, or in the Far East. So racial difference was emphasized in that relationship, and it became a perpetual relationship of power, of conquest. So those folks were looked at as two arms to do all kinds of deeds on behalf of the Europeans for economic gains. So that is a major difference between the spread of Ottoman Empire or the influx of Europeans in the Americas and the Far East and Africa.
The Ottomans were the leading country of Islamic countries, at least last periods, not the bankrupt, not destroying period, but when the Kanuni and Yavuz Sultan Selim and all those periods, they were leading, they were Caliph and leading. Do you think the affectations is coming till today? Do you think that there is some respect in other countries? When I have been in some Arabic countries, or they hide some ideas that the Ottoman or Turks now today, they are because for example now the president, they approach to the Arabic countries, they have good relations. So suddenly Arabic people remember something, or what's happening? Do you think all those leading period is some affectations comes today? Do you feel something, or?
Well, the lure of historical narrative will always be there. The common artistic, cultural traits are a constant reminder of the past we shared, that Arabs and Ottoman Turks shared. However, the contemporary period is a very complex, dynamic sphere that is different from these days past. So you have regional alliances now, you have regional powers at play. You have the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Turkey had to navigate a path within that conflict. You have an Arab Spring that spread to Syria, which with disastrous results because the president there just refused to relent to the will of the people and allow elections or step aside. And Turkey found itself a recipient of hundreds of thousands of refugees. And of course, all this, harkens to what could the Arab world learn from Turkey? How would Turkey navigate all these changes in the Middle East, given that cultural, connection of years past? And there is also the element of common religion, dominant religion at least, which is Islam. And Turkey's experiment with modernization and democracy and elections and stability. Of course, Turks are interested, apparently, and all indications point that they want stability in Egypt, they want stability in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. And they found themselves on the opposite side of the fence from Israeli policies, especially when it came to the siege of Gaza, as you know, and that ship which suffered 9 casualties who were killed by the Israelis simply for attempting to deliver humanitarian aid, unarmed people that is. So that kind of basically cemented Turkey's disposition from that conflict for a time at least. Although Turkey is a large, complicated country with needs that transcend a single event or incident. However, in the Arab world, you find a range of feelings about Turkey. Some would say we can draw lessons from the Turkish experience, especially in the case of Egypt, the oldest the most established Arab country, the largest one to be sure, the most powerful, where democracy imploded. And from what I surmised following the news, the Turkish administration was not happy or encouraged with that collapse of an elected president who is now sitting in jail, who actually entered jail the same day that his despotic predecessor walked out of jail. So all of it came crashing down. And I'm sure that someone in the Middle East, myself included to be honest, points to the Turkish successes, although it is an ongoing process, modernization that is, as a way to draw lessons in Egypt and in Syria and elsewhere, so that religious currents can coexist with, modernist secular life in harmony, at least without violence.
Last question is, according to my last question, what was the reason that Ottoman Empire, of course there is no one reason of the social evils, but what was the bankrupting, how we call, destroying of the Ottoman?
Decline.
Decline, you say, I mean, disappear from the history. What was the reason?
The decline of the Ottoman Empire was the result of a long process, over 2 centuries almost. So you have a rise of influence and wealth in Europe, and bypassing the Ottoman Empire in terms of trading for spice and silk, and reaching the Far East by going around the Horn of Africa. So that signaled the decline, at least immediately, of the Mamluk dynasty, if you recall, in Egypt, as a matter of fact, which weakened to the degree that the Ottomans subdued the Mamluks and took their holdings in roughly 1517. But the Ottoman Empire, just when it expanded its realm, also faced a different global situation, whereby Europe is siphoning all kinds of wealth from the Americas, gold and silver. The Spanish Empire became the wealthiest empire in the world because of the amount of gold they were able to extract, using the locals as chattel labor in the Americas. So there was nowhere to go but to decline, although that decline was not a collapse as such. Rather, it was a very slow process of negotiating European rise of influence and wealth, whereby Europe made up its mind that the Islamic realm, the Muslim Turks, are the quintessential enemy, that they are the strategic enemy of the West. And it was a matter of time before Europe, which became wealthy and powerful, began to eye the Ottoman Empire because it stood in its path to its rich colonies in the East. That is, Europe began to eye the Ottoman Empire's position between Europe and the Far East, and therefore Palestine per se and Syria, which were part of the Ottoman Empire, were high on the list of the Europeans for conquest. And the Ottomans were powerful, and Europe did not find it easy to do that. But the pressure stayed constant on the Ottoman Empire, so that by the 17th century, 18th century, and certainly by the early 19th century, it was felt. And the first to go was Egypt, which became semi-autonomous. As a matter of fact, the governor of Egypt, who was appointed by the Ottomans, Mehmed Ali himself, launched a challenge against the Ottoman Empire itself. He sent his sons to Syria and marched almost to Konya. And that's when the Europeans intervened and basically destroyed his navy and the Ottoman navy in order to keep the status quo and dominate the area on their own terms. So Ottoman fights began, the Arab communities began to grumble, Europeans were gaining just too much wealth and power, and they were not going to relent until their pathway to the east, beginning with the Suez Canal, but also the domination of Syria and Palestine in order to connect the Mediterranean with the Arabian Gulf or the Persian Gulf, was accomplished. They were not going to stop until that happened. And it became a competition between Europeans themselves, the Russians, the French, and the British, until 1916, before the end of World War, 2 years into World War I, they sat down and they agreed on how to divide the holdings of the Ottoman Empire. So it was a rapid improvement in industrial output in Europe and the early industrial revolution, which basically sealed the fate of the Ottoman Empire, which fell in disrepair because that process of preparing future sultans became lax, and the palace services began to crumble. So that central government, for various reasons, lack of resources, length of period, began to give way to decay. At the same time, Europe was modernizing and embarking on an industrial revolution that basically made Europe eventually what it is today, a technological powerhouse. The last point that should be borne in mind is that none of this would have been possible, the Industrial Revolution, had it not been for the contributions of the Islamic dynasties to the sciences. All spheres of science that made the Industrial Revolution possible. That discussion is now absent from the discourse on the relationship between East and West.
No problem.
There is no question that Islam ended slavery as an institution, even before the message spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula, even beyond Mecca and Medina. As a matter of fact, the first martyrs in Islamic tradition were those who defended people who were enslaved. And there are many, many examples in Islam that drew attention to the fact that the Prophet and his teachings made sure that no human being should subjugate or own or abuse another based on difference of skin color. Hence, Bilal, who commanded, as a matter of fact, all Muslims of all colors to come to prayer. That was actually a message in that regard. So slavery as an institution ceased to exist with Islam, with the spread of Islam. Now, when Islam spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula, the custom was in antiquity, although we're talking about late antiquity here, but until this time, when two great nations fought, for example, the Zoroastrians, who were engaged in a global conflict with the Sassanids, that is, whose religion is Zoroastrianism, were engaged in a huge, very, very violent war with the Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, today's Istanbul. And the custom was that when you subdue a town of, property of your enemy, you pillage, you kill the men, and you absorb the women and the children. That was the custom. So what Islam did when it spread to Syria, exactly where all that fighting was happening between East and West, as it were, at the time, between the Sassanid and the Byzantine empires, people found Islam a respite from years of conflict, some 200 years of, conflict that dragged on and brought misery and high taxation and unspeakable violence in the population. So this is not to say that, for example, Muslims were invited to enter Jerusalem, and they made a point of, when Umar, the would-be caliph at the time, the general, entered the city, the Holy Sepulchre, he made sure to take his praying carpet and pray at a distance from the Holy Sepulchre, precisely to make sure that it is not turned into a mosque. Likewise, when Muslims spread into areas where Arabic-speaking and non-Arabic-speaking inhabitants lived, they basically did not practice that old custom of killing everyone or taking slaves. They gave Christians and Jews, as the people of the book, sanction, and they can remain as is. For the non-monotheists, they had a choice. You either become Muslim or you'll be put to the sword. Some of whom fled, some converted. So forward centuries after Islam, this habit of absorbing your enemy rather than killing them became practiced widely by the Buyids, by the Abbasid dynasty, and before them by the Umayyads. There has to be a clear distinction between this act of absorption of your enemies, including their young boys, for example, and bringing them into the fold of the religion, forcibly or otherwise, and slavery as such. That is not slavery, because the Mamluks, a word that means the people who are owned by someone else, gained a lot of experience in administration and warfare and became rulers in Egypt, and their name remained Mamluks, the ones who were owned by remnants of the Abbasid dynasty. Yet they became the masters of the house in Baghdad itself and also in Cairo. And if you can apply the same to the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Arabs and Muslims are often blamed for slavery because the Venetians had a huge appetite for abducting and smuggling slaves to Europe through the North Africa, through the Arab Middle East. And some historians blame Arabs for that, and many people, for political reasons, would take that out of context. So, were those people who were absorbed treated fairly all the time? Probably not. However, enough of them became themselves the new age of Muslims across the Balkans, for example. The Ottomans did the same thing. But in the Ottoman time, as is the case with in Persia and elsewhere, Islam was adopted to the local customs and traditions. So that practice became even more refined, whereby the Sultan would marry different women from different cultures and countries in order to bring those cultures together. That's why the early Ottomans made sure to marry women from Europe and expanded into Europe before they spread eastward, by the way, from the early beginnings in Bursa, near Istanbul, in Western Anatolia. So that practice can be looked at. The harem, for example, is also misunderstood for a subservient life of women who are, sexual objects. The reality is far from that. The mother of the most promising young boy was very powerful for a period when that process of educating the young and preparing them for leadership began to fall on hard times. The woman stepped up to the plate and actually ruled for a short period in Ottoman history. So those people who were absorbed from the Balkans and elsewhere, Albanians, you name it, stood a chance of becoming the backbone for the Ottoman fighting force. Some of the Sipahis were non-Turks. Arabs themselves were part of the Ottoman apparatus of their rule. But some actually ascended to become sultans themselves. So, in keeping with Islam, less attention was given to your racial orientation or ethnic orientation. In fact, Islam transcended all that and equated among people to a point that it ceased to become a strictly or exclusively Arab religion. It became the property of Turks who carried the banner of Islam for centuries. For 3 of them are glorious centuries where they reached the zenith of sophistication and in administration, in the sciences, in the arts, in all spheres of life. The same thing happened on the Eastern Front in Persia, where Turkmen who became Muslims also achieved a very high degree of refinement. So I think using the term slavery loosely is a misnomer for a very sophisticated, very complicated process of absorption, training, and for the purpose of spreading the word of Islam or maintaining a dynasty of sorts.